Welcome to Friday, April 10th edition of Hromadsko's weekly wrap-up. I'm Carrie Oderman, and again, I'm recording this week's show from home. Kiev is under lockdown, and since April 6th, the restrictions are even tighter. Most noticeable, if you're in public, you need to wear a face mask. Only grocery stores, pharmacies, banks, and gas stations are open, and public transport can only be used by those who work at places providing essential services like these. Everyone is supposed to stay at home. So how are Ukrainians doing at home? And what are Ukrainians doing at home? Today we have three guests that are going to talk about just this. First, James Brook, editor of Ukrainian Business News, will talk about the virus economy and who can still work from home and what makes Ukraine different than the rest of the world. He'll also address maybe some of the secret winners of the COVID economy. Dominika Stojanoska, she's a program specialist at UN Women, and she'll discuss what gender equality means for women under quarantine. And after covering living at home and working at home, journalist and colleague Maria Romanenko will talk about what Ukrainians are doing online. As every week, I'm an outsider looking in. I'm going to ask the questions our English-speaking viewers have. Our guests are going to give us background, create context, and help cut through the noise. Welcome to the show.
We're all at home this week in Kiev, and James Brook from the Ukraine Business News is joining us also from his home. Thanks for joining us, Jim.
Thank you, Carrie.
Ukraine's economy was already in a poor condition when COVID-19 reached the country. The quarantine is going to slow down and stop a lot of the business growth that we've seen in the past few months. I want to talk to you a little bit about what working from home and being under lockdown means to Ukraine. A lot of companies have gone out of business already, you reported. Let's talk about that first.
Yes, especially the hotels. Half the restaurants in Kiev are closed. I talked to the man who used to run the Radisson, and he said, why stay open and cost cut? I think what's more interesting are the winners, and the winners will be e-commerce, very definitely. Kiev, oddly, has become a city of bicycle and motorcycle couriers. So you're seeing a lot of these yellow and green boxes going through the streets, delivering basically food from restaurants, and also, probably furniture and bigger stuff. So this will come out of this with a big shift towards familiarity with ordering online, food especially. And so I think we'll see a big boost in e-commerce. That'll be a big plus for the economy.
You had reported that this might actually shift a lot of people to working from home, up to about 20%. But is Ukraine cut out for this? People have low income, small apartments. Can people really effectively work from home here?
Well, the single people definitely can. Carrie, I work in the Leonardo Business Center, and I can go to my office right around the corner. It's next to the opera. And I walk down these silent corridors, and these are all IT people who presumably are working at home. It's kind of spooky. Really, no one is there. And I think people are learning that they don't necessarily have to work from home. On the employer side, it's a plus because you can cheap out on real estate, maybe have 1.5 people per desk, that kind of thing. But for many employees, it gives them flexibility, take care of their kids, cut out a very unpleasant 2-hour commute, 1 hour each way. The cost of commuting here isn't that great, but it can be very unpleasant, these jammed subway cars, you can't even get a seat. So for a lot of people, it could give them an extra 2 hours to their day and more time with their kids. But you have to learn, obviously, how to do it and, mix it up.
Some of the conversations you've had with business people, are there employees? Is there a sharp learning curve? Are they being as effective as at home? Are Ukrainians starting to get the hang of working from home?
Well, I talked to one American friend who runs an engineering company, and he reminded one of his guys, you have a team. And unfortunately, there is this thing, out of sight, out of mind, and they're not really working, and they're not really that close by, and it's hard to delegate. So you have to obviously learn how to use what you have and to remind people this is work, and you have KPIs and key performance indicators. Otherwise, the whole country's just on vacation for a month, and we'll come back rested after the May holidays.
Well, you and I are both working from home. I don't know how rested we are. Let's talk about unemployment, because not everyone can work from home. And you had mentioned hotels, restaurants, they're not serving people as they have in the past. What's going on with unemployment here? What's the situation in Ukraine compared to other countries?
Well, there really isn't much of a safety net. I spent some time in Cambodia where people actually buy gold, and that's their safety net. Oddly, they closed the pawn shops here for 3 weeks, which left people out. But what's more important is that these surveys show that the average Ukrainian has 1 month of margin or a cushion. And in the east, the southeast area where there's a conflict going on, it's only 2 weeks. So a lot of people are really on the edge. Now, maybe they can pawn something, maybe they can borrow, but they really need to get back to work. And I think the government is increasingly aware of that and trying to sort of phase in certain industries. I mean, they banned in a country that, 40% of exports are food. This is a farming country, and people in Kiev would sometimes pretend that's not true. They actually shut down the sale of feed, seed, fertilizers, pesticides, just as the spring sowing season is starting. And they're acting as if this is Singapore, but no, this is Ukraine, the Black Earth country that floods the world with wheat and corn and soy and sunflower oil. So they've learned, and they took that away. Frankly, I think the farmers probably ignored that kind of prohibition. And so they're gradually letting people do work like, external house painters or people selling construction materials, that if they wear the masks, there's really no reason to shut them down. And they are passing these relief measures, and they will run a big deficit, and they will run up inflation to pay these relief measures. Whether the money really gets to people, let's see.
Now, you talked about people have 4 weeks, 2 weeks. What's going to happen when the money really runs out? We're going to have an informal economy beginning. People are going to start to barter, trade. People have to put food on their table. What are people's options here?
I think what's happening right now is they say this will peak between the 2 Easters. This Sunday, we have the Catholic Easter, Catholic Protestant Easter, and 1 week later, we have the Orthodox Easter. And so they're very worried, frankly, that people go to church, not because they're anti-religious, they just don't want to have people cheek by jowl jamming into churches. And so they want to get over that hump, the 2 Easters. And then I think they'll increasingly ease up and let people, offices reopen, this sort of thing. Restaurants are going to be tough. Entertainment venues like bars, concerts, it's tough. There are 150,000 restaurant workers out of work. And I think they're realizing that maybe it wasn't too smart to encourage every Ukrainian to come home. I mean, why? Why not just stay where you are unless you're out of work? And Poland is getting desperate because they really need the Ukrainian workers. So they said, we'll have an amnesty on visa overstays. We'll give you free testing for Corona. We'll give you free treatment in the hospitals for Corona. I mean, they really are tailoring a package to keep the Ukrainians they have and to bring more back. And the Polish Construction Union and the Polish Farmers Union have specifically leaned on the government saying, we need the Ukrainians back to keep going. So, reality is penetrating the leaders.
Well, we've talked about getting food on the table. Now let's take it up a couple more levels to politics. We just saw that 2 of the main criteria for the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to give that huge loan to Ukraine passed last week. Some people say the Ukrainians, their hand was somewhat forced because they were considering trying to go without IMF support. Could it also be seen the other way around, that even though the nearly 6,000 amendments, the so-called anti-Kolomoisky bill, have been put on the table, that the IMF's hand's going to be forced a little bit, because it'll be really hard to say no to Ukraine right now when they need this support for the economy?
I think the IMF can say no to Ukraine. I think Ukraine has a sort of iffy track record of meeting IMF obligations. And I think that's one reason why the government is working very hard to make this happen. And the land law passed, the new budget will pass. And, we'll see about the so-called anti-Kolomoisky law. I think that is a deal breaker. And I think the president knows that. It's very interesting that he did have a working coalition with the former President Poroshenko's pro-Western party. And that was an informal coalition, but that's a good sign. I think it also means that he will probably stop prosecuting and interrogating the former president. So, but I think, it's either me or the deluge. I mean, if they do not go with the IMF, there will be a default. Inflation will go out of control. Ukraine will be sort of in the category of Argentina, Venezuela, kind of an outlying, unattractive place for investors, which is a real turnaround than just 6 weeks ago. I mean, the end of February, everything looked great. All the macroeconomics, low inflation, low debt to GDP, 3% growth. Things look great.
You're right. Okay. And the world was a different place 6 weeks ago. Usually when the IMF decides to give someone a loan, it's a sign for other investors to come in. Now with COVID, even if Ukraine gets the IMF loan, international investors aren't really going to feel that certain anymore coming to Ukraine, are they?
Yeah. I think the IMF says $81 billion has left the emerging markets in a big whoosh. It's the biggest move of capital out of emerging markets that they've ever seen. $81 billion. So it is a different world. And on one hand, the IMF gives a desperately needed internationally recognized seal of approval. On the other hand, it will be a bridge to getting through this year. And this will be a lost economic year. There will be GDP drop.
Finally, Jim, as someone that's worked internationally for many, many years, the COVID-19 crisis, this pandemic, is there anything that you can compare it to? So with this comparison, you can make any estimations of what's going to happen?
No, this is really unprecedented. I mean, it makes me sound old, but my mother lived through the Spanish influenza and 1918, and it left her with a lifelong appreciation for fresh air and sunshine, which apparently was the best counteractive. But this is, that's why the head of the IMF says this is the worst economic crisis in a century. And there's no way to minimize it. Latest is that by June, half the airlines in the world could be bankrupt. It's a brave new world out there, and we'll just have to see where it comes. In terms of Ukraine, I live right here in Golden Gate, which is a very scenic center for international tourists. And across the street, there's a Airbnb where friends stayed. You go and get there for 2 nights, and he was kicked out because someone else had rented it, and it was $60 a night. Now the owner has it on the market at $18 a night, and I'm sure it's empty. So we're all going to have to adapt. And I would like to think there will be a steady and smooth recovery, but it depends on whether the virus comes back. And going back to my mother's tales, my grandparents had them live in the countryside in the dacha in Massachusetts for the winter, because the Spanish flu came back, and there was 1 week in October where 5,000 people in Philadelphia were killed. So what the fear is, this will come back with the flu season. So we will be back to semi-normal in August, and there'll be reports creeping in that it's on its return.
Well, history does have a tendency to repeat itself. Let's hope that's not the case with COVID-19. James Brook, thank you so much for joining us today. You're a neighbor of mine. I could almost wave to you down the block. Too bad we had to meet like this. I hope we get to meet face to face again. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you. Bye.
Joining us today is Dominika Stojanoska from UN Women to talk about the effect that COVID-19 has on certain sectors of the population. Everyone can get COVID-19. However, when disease and pandemics occur, certain parts of the population are more affected. Marginalized groups are more affected. Existing inequalities are amplified. How does that happen, and why is that?
Hello, good afternoon, Kari, and thank you for this interview. Actually, you are right. You're correct. The pandemic that we're all living in, we say we're all under the same situation, but in reality, it's not, because the pandemic is impacting differently men and women, and we're seeing that coming from how the pandemic is expanding. And in particular, we're saying that it will impact the existing inequalities, and in particular, those who are more vulnerable. And I'm talking about different categories of citizens, people with disabilities, refugees, migrants, internally displaced people, all elderly, so single mothers and single fathers. So it really impacts, but what we're seeing that, however, it impacts heavily more disproportionately on women. First, in the health sector, like the frontline workers, as you see globally, we know that 70% of them engaged in health and social sector are women. In Ukraine, we have the 82% actually that are in health and social services, which are women. So those are our frontline workers who are mostly exposed at risks to get infected. And actually the statistics we're getting from Spain, from Italy, actually that the frontline workers, women, among them women are more affected because they are more present. But that's an increased risk on first place, but on the other, it's also additional stress because of the paid and unpaid work. This is their engagement in the frontline workers and paid work. But then we have to...
Let me interrupt you for a minute. This differentiation between paid and unpaid labor might not be familiar to all of our viewers. Could you explain about that quick before you go on?
Yes, we're talking about all the domestic work women are, all the care work women are taking care in the homes. That's what we call unpaid. It's something that we used to say it's the work we all need to continue what the formal economy needs to survive on, meaning all the work, care work for children, cleaning, cooking, washing, everything that we need to go on. And we're saying that we're considering this an unpaid care work, and that's what the formal economy lives on, actually. So now with the pandemic and with the quarantine and the lockdown, we see that the unpaid work really disproportionately affects women, either working women or not working women. The care work increases because of the closure of schools. Anyway, everybody needs to go on, and that's differently. If we are saying that before pandemic, women used to work 3 times more in doing the unpaid care work. Now with the pandemic, this increases even more. And not only about working the usual work, but also now taking care of children, thinking about the homeworks. And this is because of the existing gender stereotypes and the patriarchal social norms that we have. So the domestic work is on women, and it's undervalued and it's unrecognized. And that it exists, although, and it exhausts women. So that's also a fact. So we see it with the pandemic increasing. Yes, please.
Well, if the economy depends on this labor and women are working even more, if it was like you said, 3 times more, 4 and 5 times more, how can the women hold this out? What's happening, and what's happening specifically in Ukraine?
Well, it's happening everywhere, actually. And it is a huge burden, and we see it, even the negative consequences. People are losing their job now with the pandemic. It's difficult for everyone. It's particularly difficult for women. So they have more unstable jobs. So if they're losing their jobs, they have less savings. So they have to still continue carrying out that unpaid care work, and we're seeing the rate of domestic violence increasing. It increases in countries which are heavily affected by COVID, but also we have the initial data coming also from Ukraine. Also after the first quarantine and lockdown, we saw a 30% increase in calling of the helpline. So it happens, and it is a strain on women. And what we are actually advocating now is to think about the immediate consequences of the COVID. So protecting the healthcare workers, giving them the conditions on the frontline workers to be able to continue to do their work, but also thinking about the effects, the immediate effects, how to protect from what is happening as a consequences of the lockdown and the quarantine. And then the advocacy is strong to really consider services for support for domestic violence survivors, not even survivors, I would say victim now, to be declared and considered as essential, and to have the funding to the government from either public or private funds to be able to, for them to run, because we're saying domestic violence is the pandemic with a pandemic now. We used to say that domestic gender-based violence is a global pandemic, and now we have actually the pandemic within the pandemic. So these services are essential because they're life savings. And
now, we're in our first week of a stricter lockdown here in Ukraine. In Italy, France, and Spain, after 2 weeks, there was an increase in domestic violence reports and calls to helpline. That means we're coming up on this point. Traditionally, women don't have that strong of a voice in Ukrainian politics. There's not that many women involved in politics. Is the Zelensky administration or the parliament doing anything to plan for this problem, this domestic violence problem that's bound to happen also in Ukraine?
Well, we actually, with the latest elections, we saw increase in the representation of women in the parliament, in Ukrainian parliament, which is a very positive sign. And we have also the Equal Opportunity Caucus in the parliament, who is who has a large membership and is very well aware of the consequences of the COVID. And actually, in our regular communication, we do have talks about actually how what is the role of the parliament, how to increase awareness, and how to make sure that the packages, the stimulus fiscal packages which are there, and the social protection policies take into account what actually is happening and the consequences. And the call is really, and the advocacy as United Nations is towards the government to consider to make the women's voices and consider the importance of the work women are doing in community, even online work, even teleworking, but it's important voice, and the perspective needs to be definitely included in the overall response. So United Nations is actually supporting that and advocating, and we are seeing now since yesterday the global brief from the United Nations from the Secretary General was actually promoted and launched to pay attention, calling upon the governments to take into account the consequences on gender equality and the risk of increasing the inequalities and the gaps as a consequence of the COVID, and to take a differentiated approach in response to the crisis, like differently from what we had in the economic crisis in 2008, now to make gender equality at the center and include women's voices in that. And Ukrainian society has a very, very vibrant civil society, actually, where women are very much engaged, and even since the beginning of the crisis, and we regularly are in communication with the civil society organizations. They have been very active in reaching out to the networks of women and understanding what is the strain on them and what is the actual immediate consequences they are facing. And many of them have launched already small grant support to really support the immediate needs. But in any way, the overall planning of the consequences of the crisis and the fiscal stimulus and the economic response for recovery needs to take into account the perspective of women, and there's a lot there that can be contributed to the overall response from the government.
Well, let's hope someone's listening to this advice, because it's certainly good advice. I really thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
After covering what businesses are doing and what Ukrainians are doing at home, we've got Maria Romanenko, a colleague of mine, who's going to talk about what's going on in the news and on the internet in Ukraine. Thanks for joining us, Maria.
Thank you for having me, Kari.
Right away on Monday, there were stricter enforcements for the lockdown here in Kiev. People had to start wearing masks. People were told to stay at home. But there were people that didn't want to listen. And there was one story that was in the news in Ukraine about something that happened at Hydro Park. What happened there?
So basically, I think it's important to understand the context here. So in Hydro Park, which is like this beachside area in Kiev, there is this outdoor gym that is very popular, especially among a lot of men. I'm guessing that the majority of people who go there are men. And it's just like a free outdoor gym, which is very old, like quite rusty, but it's very popular because it's free. And when the weather is nice, it's just nice to go there and work out. obviously with the new regulations, all the like relaxation zones, recreation zones are forbidden, are out of bounds. So obviously that applies to that gym as well. And a lot of like that gym goers that go to that gym, they are not happy about this. So they try to reach that gym anyway, and they weren't allowed to. So one guy, he just said that he's gonna swim like through the river to get to the gym.
And Hydro Park is like on an island in the Dnieper River. So
yes,
he swam over.
Yeah, he swam over, and obviously the law enforcement officers saw him doing that, so they quickly got to the, you know, the area where he would be attempting to get out, and just detained him. And what was funny is there was just like these pictures going around in the video. So what makes this an amusing story is that there were like 13 police officers, I think, like just sort of trying to detain one man. And people were like, it just kind of went viral because first of all, it's like a nice picture because there's a beach and, you know, and just like quite an interesting situation. And secondly, it's because what people were saying, like that the 13 police officers extended so closely to each other and to the man as well is more dangerous than, you know, that one man getting there. So it's kind of like a paradox situation.
Okay, so one guy got out and tried to work out, but a lot of Ukrainian students are at home right now because they're doing school online. President Zelensky has set up a classroom. How's that working?
So every morning, different TV channels in Ukraine broadcast different lessons, and it's basically divided like for different years. So like this year 5, year 6, year 7, and basically they show lessons, like it can either be like geography, history, maths, whatever. And they have like a teacher and a student, and the teacher is obviously like a regular teacher from a school, and then a student is usually like somebody, a celebrity or a politician. So, for example, yesterday morning, Olena Zelenska, Ukraine's first lady, was a student, and she was like doing this Ukrainian language lessons. A lot of these students are like, you know, presidential parties MPs, which also gained criticism because people are saying that Ukrainian government is using this like home education, online education to leverage, you know, their political party. So that was one part of the criticism. But overall, it's like, you know, just sort of on, like not online, even like TV lessons for students of different years.
They did a pretty quick turnaround with this too, didn't they? They got it set up within just a few days to fill the gap after schools were closed. That has to be looked at positively.
Yeah, that's a positive thing, of course. Even like my mom is watching it, so you don't have to be a school student to watch it.
How about, so we know what the students are doing, we know what, you know, people are trying to do to sneak out and work out. What are businesses doing? There's been a lot of stories globally about businesses stepping up and filling gaps and innovation. Are there any key stories coming out of Ukraine right now?
I mean, I haven't really heard about, like, Ukrainian businesses are doing a lot in terms of like some companies. There's like an online shop that is offering, they have this like a set of essential like food products, and there's some stuff like toilet paper in there. So basically like essentials that everybody needs. And they offer people to pay for it, which is only like 300 hryvnias or something like that, which is, I guess, like about 10 euros. And people can buy that, and in that way like sponsor a pensioner. So basically the company then delivers to a pensioner of their choice this set of essentials. There's a lot of stuff like that, and there are other companies like a cafe that delivers coffee beans to doctors who work with coronavirus patients. So there are like positive stories like that. So it's yeah.
What about in the tech industry? There was a Ukrainian company that was trying to develop a COVID-19 quick test.
Yeah, there is an institute, I can't remember what it's called now, but it's an institute in Kiev, and they said that they came up with their own test kit for the coronavirus, and that they have the capacity to produce more, but no finance to produce more. So that I think is on hold. But then also what's an interesting thing that recently, like a couple of days ago, Ukraine's Deputy Health Minister, Viktor Leshko, said that Ukraine could be testing more people, like having more tests and testing more people, but there's no need for that. And it's very interesting because, like, for example, if you look at a country like Germany, they are testing loads of people, and a lot of people did test positive, but their mortality rate is quite low. And I think that's probably because a lot of people, like, they have very mild symptoms, so it's not death-threatening, but they are thinking of it in the way, like, if you know that you're tested positive, you are more cautious, like you don't go out, you don't meet other people. So I think it doesn't really make sense looking at other countries like Germany.
Ukrainians love to go outside. So my final question for you is, I know it's hard to stay inside, but today, this Friday, it wasn't so hard because the air quality was really bad in Kiev. One of the worst globally. What's causing that?
Yeah, so this morning, this is no longer the case, but this morning one company rated Kiev like number one for, the worst air pollution level. And that constantly, like for the past few days, people have been worried about the level of air quality in Kiev. And the reason I think is there are a lot of fires happening these days. On one day, there were like over 100 fires around Kiev. And then more notably, I think, which got more like international coverage was the fire in Chernobyl, which is still hasn't been completely put out. There are like still around 400 fire extinguishers, like firefighters fighting this fire. So this is the reason, I guess, because a lot of people, like, they burn dry grass, and like I think it's against the law, and nobody really understands why people do that if it's so damaging to the environment, to people's health and stuff like this. But that seems to be causing the smell that some people can smell in the air, and then also the air pollution levels.
Okay, we've covered a lot, but there's one thing I want to know from you. What is your favorite thing and your least favorite thing about lockdown?
My favorite thing, I guess, is that I don't know, it can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing that I don't have to commute to work. So that means I don't have to put like nice outdoor clothes every day. I can just work in my lunch clothes, but that might be a bad thing as well, because that means that sometimes you're less disciplined. So I find the biggest struggle for me is that like not working during the work hours, like, just doing something that you think is going to take like half an hour, but then you end up spending more time, but then working at like nighttime until like 11 p.m. Like, there is basically, my office is in my bedroom, so there is no like boundaries, like this is the time I work, so, and this is the time I don't work. Like, I need to get better at that.
I absolutely agree with you. Thank you so much for joining us from your room, from my living room. I hope we get to see each other at the office soon when this is all over. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Kari. Thanks. Bye.
On Wednesday, the European Union's Court of Justice told Poland to suspend the Supreme Court's disciplinary chamber, which was created as part of judicial reform enacted by the ruling Law and Justice Party. The EU's top court said that the disciplinary chamber was not independent and that it had breached EU law. The panel, whose members are elected by the legislature where the Law and Justice Party have a majority, has the power to discipline judges over their rulings. Earlier, Russian President Vladimir Putin extended Russia's nationwide week off end of April without even mentioning the word quarantine. He also authorized regional authorities to deal with the COVID-19 outbreak as they see fit without waiting for instructions from the Kremlin. According to Novaya Gazeta's political editor, the management system has become paralyzed in the face of a pandemic, as this attempt to shift responsibility to regional authorities is being undermined by the over-centralized system that Putin has himself built over the last 20 years. Nothing extraordinary is happening in Belarus. Or at least that's according to the country's deputy health minister. The deputy minister's words reflect statements by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, who has previously proclaimed that the most dangerous epidemic is panic and called the pandemic a psychosis. Despite 70% of Belarusians saying that they do support a government ban on public events, virtually no restrictions on public movement or gatherings have been put into place. Some experts believe this is due to the fact that the country, which cannot rely on Western aid, simply can't afford a lockdown. As of April 10th, there were 1,486 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Belarus. The wave of repression against the opposition continues in Azerbaijan, with the quarantine regime and the fight against coronavirus being used as justification. The latest oppositionist affected is Faik Amirli, a member of the opposition Azerbaijani Popular Front Party, who was sentenced to 30 days on charges of violating the quarantine regime. NIDA activist and former political prisoner Ilkim Rustamzadeh reported experiencing pressure from the police as well as blackmail and bullying. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe called this the beginning of a new round of repression and stated that President Ilham Aliyev is using the pandemic to suppress the opposition.
We'll be back next Friday reporting stories from Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Don't forget, we're on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. But until we do, that's the week wrapped up. But wait, that's not all. Hromadske reports 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, keeping you informed for 5 years now. In the changing media landscape, we need to make sure that stories about Ukraine keep coming from Ukraine. Here's how.
I would like us to be heard, not only in Ukraine, but all over the world.
No bread for 3 months.
Not one, but look how many. There's bread here and there.
You are going against the God.
Of course, point number 1.
Thanks for the invitation.
When will this all end?
The number of political prisoners has grown,